From the Center for Agricultural Profitability at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, this is Nebraska Farmcast. I'm Ryan Evans, and on this episode, we'll be looking at some content from this year's Nebraska Farm Real Estate Market Highlights Survey, which was recently published by the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. And it includes a special feature section this year that takes a closer look at the emerging trends and considerations for cover crops and their implications on lease arrangements. So we'll delve into these findings and explore motivations and benefits of cover crops for landowners and operators across the state. And to offer that insight, I'm joined by Jim Jansen, an agricultural economist with the Center for Agricultural Profitability and Nebraska Extension here at UNL. Jim, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me today.
So you've got a new article that we've linked to in the description to this podcast. It's on our website at cap.unl.edu. And this year's Nebraska Farm Real Estate Report does mention that cover crops were planted on about 4.4% of Nebraska cropland in 2022. So can you just talk about the regional variations in cover crop utilization across the state?
Yeah, so as part of the report, we took a look at the 8 different regions. The 8 different regions are referred to as agricultural statistic districts. And inside of those, we can gain some insight on, one, how much cropland acreage is in each area of the state, how many producers planted cover crops, and also the overall number of cover crops in the state in terms of the acreage. What we've seen is across the districts, there was a low in the northwestern Nebraska. Obviously is a little bit different environment for production. Average was about 53,000 acres. And in the higher spots would be in the eastern part of the state, one of those regions being the East District. The East District had about 205,000 acres of cover crops, but also have the most number of cropland acres by region of the state out of any region. On average, most districts had around about 100,000 acres, give or take a little bit. Some of these things might be influenced by the presence of livestock. Also, if you're in an area where there's a nutrient management plan put in place by the local regulatory authority, there might be some influences requiring folks to utilize some of these things. There's different factors on why people might be utilizing them. Overall, in the state of Nebraska, the number of cover crop acres, according to the 2022 Census of Agriculture, was about 925,686 acres out of approximately 21 million acres of cropland in this state.
And we know that cover crops obviously offer benefits to the land and the soil. Can you just elaborate on those quickly, the specific benefits, soil health and conservation?
Sure. There's many different reasons why folks might plant cover crops. One is to keep the soil in place. Simply put, depending upon the type of crop, when you harvested, an example, if you chop corn for silage, you might follow it up with a cover crop just to get some coverage on the ground. Environmental benefits also can include the management of nutrients, keeping nutrients in a form in an area of the soil instead of getting into the water supply or something that may not be a desirable trait. Also in the state of Nebraska, we have a very robust cattle industry. And with that being said, cover crops can be used for a variety of things in the production life cycle of the animals, whether using as a feed component in a dry lot situation. Folks can graze the crops depending on what time of the year. Even in certain areas of the state in the springtime, they might even consider calving their cows out on those parcels because they might be a dry area that has grass established and things of that nature. So it really depends upon where you're at in the state and the pressing issues surrounding it on why folks might plant a cover crop and the considerations related to that.
And if they are, as you mentioned, grazing, if they're using cover crops for grazing or for forage, what are some of the longer term benefits that might not be realized right away?
So that probably one of the biggest things would incorporate the changes in the soil profile. Soil that has a higher organic content or a higher carbon level tends to look more like potting soil versus a sandier or a less desirable parcel. So that really the organic matter is one of the biggest things. 2, once again, is just keeping the soil in place. We can get sporadic rainfalls in the state and at certain periods of time. Cover crops can be beneficial for holding that soil in place. And also with the advancements in newer planting technologies, a lot heavier planters that have no-till or minimum till apparatuses attached to them, planting into a cover crop seed bed is not unheard of. And in fact, in some areas, it can be quite common. So there's a lot of flexibility with what you can do with the cover crop, the benefits with the soil, but also if you're someone that's a livestock producer that's facing a drought year or a very dry year, instead of terminating that cover crop, maybe you decide to alter your planting assignment of acreages between corn and soybeans and maybe include a higher rate of cover crops to use as an alternative forage source. So there's some degree of flexibility in the management of it too, and which in the long run helps the farmer out when we experience drought or some extremes in the weather for whatever reason.
And establishing and terminating cover crops, that can be an added expense, obviously, for operators. So how can those costs play into lease arrangements between the landowners and the tenants? And what might help to address the expenses in a lease arrangement?
Yeah, so there's different ways to terminate cover crops, and it probably depends upon what you're using. I think rye is probably one of the more economical seed varieties to be planting in terms of a cover crop, and also fairly easy to terminate, whether it's through some type of chemical means or even some type of tillage means. It does cost money to terminate them. When it comes to a farmland lease on rented ground, cover crops tend to be a situation where there are benefits that extend beyond the typical 1-year lease period. And especially if you're in an area where a land tenant may not be interested in doing it and the landlord would like one of these practices to occur out there, this would be one thing that someone can easily consider that might utilize this in it. So I would encourage folks, the best way to get someone to do something is to consider maybe providing some type of financial incentive in the lease arrangement. So maybe that's deducting or cost sharing or paying a portion of the bill. But more likely than not, and some of the things that we've seen from our survey work, about a third of the time we see a discount between $1 to $9 and $10 to $20 per acre. 2% of the time is a very small percent of the time, according to survey responses from this article. We see a discount of around $21, and we still see on about 68% of the leases not providing any discount. But just like everything else, the cost of seed has increased, and with that being said, that $10 to $20 range is probably not covering the whole cost of either planting or terminating or doing other production practices related to the establishment or termination of a cover crop, but it does share in the portion of the expense. And also landlords and tenants need to be looking at any cost share programs available to help deal with the expenses associated with planting or terminating those cover crops. So be sure to take a look at those opportunities if they exist in your area.
Yeah, and when you look into your crystal ball, is there any observation or expectations you have for the future adoption of cover crops in Nebraska, the way the trend's going, and how those might influence lease agreements in the years to come?
Yeah. Well, we can grow corn and soybeans in our state. There's no question about that. The big question is can we do this in a manner that makes sense and can tame the climatic variations we can have across the state? We live in a state that's around 44, 45 million acres. I think there's more changes in the weather patterns in terms of rainfall from the southeast tip of the state to the northwest tip. I think we go from the low 30s to the mid-teens by the time we get out to the Scottsbluff and northwest Nebraska area. So with that being said, the adoption and utilization of these practices will vary across the state subject to rainfall. Rainfall is always the biggest thing in our state. Crop varieties have gotten better over time to handle some of the changes we've seen in rainfall and that. But also there might be some pushes in public policy to either incentivize or discount or do things that would encourage the utilization of cover crops for better or for worse. So be aware of what those might be and stay informed. And even with some of the agencies at the local level that have an effect on the policies guiding these things, be sure to stay involved and be aware of these things. With the presence of livestock in a state, especially cattle, I think cover crops are a popular thing that can maybe extend the growing season or the utilization of the ground beyond the traditional grazing period that we might have on grazing land, and extend also our growing season on cropland. I think some of the advancements will probably come with how can we distribute this seed out there in a time frame or a period when you might have a corn that's still tasseling or something like that. So how do we figure those things out? And some of the newer planting technologies, minimum till, no-till, there's a lot of heavier equipment that can handle some of the residue on the ground if you're trying to do some of these things. So there will be a wide variety of things people look at in terms of trying to figure out a strategy that works for them well.
Great. And you can find out more about what we've been talking about on this episode here with Jim Jansen in his new article that is linked to in the podcast notes here if you're listening on pretty much any platform out there. And you can always find it on our Center for Ag Profitability's website at cap.unl.edu, which is also home to the full 2023-2024 Nebraska Farm Real Estate Market Highlights Survey and Report. Jim, thanks for joining me.
Thanks for having us.
Nebraska Farmcast is a production of the Center for Agricultural Profitability at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. For the latest research-based information and education resources to manage your farm or ranch operation, visit our website at cap.unl.edu. That's cap.unl.edu.